SEP Fanfic Readings presents Finding Hermione by ebookdragon. Chapter 39. A Trip to Olivanders. Morning of January 16th. Draco opened his morning paper to find an article from their not-so-secret stalker gracing the front page. He was going to have to make good on that promise of a house that he'd told Hermione he'd give whoever was publishing photos of them. Draco looked over the top of the paper at Hermione sitting in her seat beside him and smirked. She barely looked awake. Her hair had a decidedly rumpled look. She still had a bit of dry drool trailing down the left corner of her mouth. Draco wasn't going to point out that it was there, though. She'd hastily donned his Slytherin Quidditch jersey and a pair of blue and white striped pajama bottoms before coming down to breakfast. Rose was already at school. Tansy thankfully got her ready, and Draco took her while Hermione refused to get out of bed that morning. The desire to sleep seemingly hit her more forcefully this morning. Draco figured it was the result of her pregnancy. Draco couldn't help but chuckle to himself as he remembered trying to wake her and her mumbled protest to be left alone to sleep. Draco slid out of bed, detaching himself reluctantly from her grasp. Hermione stole his pillow as he moved away, and seemed to think that it was just as good to wrap herself around as his torso. He turned his attention from Hermione and her rather impressive bedhead, and returned to reading the article on the front page. Divorce Bill comes to a vote tomorrow, by Luna Lovegood. Tomorrow we, hopefully, take one step closer to equality and freedom in our society. A divorce bill, created by Hermione Granger and Theodore Nott, goes before the Wizengamot tomorrow. This bill will allow unhappily married couples to sever the bonds of matrimony. I obtained a copy of the bill from a trusted source. The new laws outlined will be groundbreaking for our society. There are provisions in the new bill for immediate divorce for spouses on the basis of imprisonment, abandonment, or abuse. If you don't fall into one of those categories, have no fear. One of the new laws will allow no-fault divorce, which means that a couple can amicably decide to split and go their separate ways. No harm, no foul. Now, dear readers, I can practically hear some of you screeching, "What about the children? We need to think of the children." To answer this, I ask you to think for a moment. What do you think is best for children? Two parents living together who are miserable in their marriage and make their misery or indifference known to all around them, or parents who live happily apart and hopefully raise their children cooperatively. Happy parents usually mean happy children. Some of you are probably thinking, I'm not planning on getting a divorce. This bill doesn't apply to me. Why should I support it? We are so happy that your marriage is successful. What if someday your children aren't so successful in their partners? You would want them to have the means of freeing themselves from an unhappy union. Also, ever fancy a career in the ministry? This new bill will create new jobs within the ministry. A whole new department would be opening up with the passing of this bill. The Department of Family Law will need many witches and wizards interested in providing help in ending marriages, mediating property disputes and division of assets, and mediating custody arrangements. Parenting classes and family counseling will also be offered, and will need teachers and mind healers for those services. Article continued on page 8, second column. Draco chuckled as he set down the paper. Who was Luna's reliable source? He asked Hermione. Hermione set down her spoon and looked over at him in amusement. She dabbed at her lips with her napkin. The bit of drool was flaking off slowly from the side of her mouth. I might have sent her a copy of the proposed bill with notes on what some of the legal jargon meant. Draco wasn't surprised. He was a little disappointed that he hadn't thought of it first. Draco shrugged off his disappointment, though. It was Hermione's right to spread news of the bill she had a hand in creating as she saw fit. Draco picked up a letter and opened it. He smiled as he scanned the contents. Who's that from? Hermione asked curiously. She spread a generous helping of butter and raspberry jam on her toast before returning her attention to him as she took her first bite. A glob of jelly slid off her toast, and Hermione made a grab for it, but missed, and the jelly landed with a splat on her pajamas. Mr. Parkinson, Draco answered with a grin, resisting the urge to laugh outright, setting the letter back down on the table. We've been invited to Parkinson Lodge for tea this afternoon. That's good news, Hermione responded as she cast a quick Scourgify on herself. I suppose we should go to Olivanders first and see what he has to say. Well, you're the one who slept in this morning, Draco said wryly, calling attention to their differences in attire. I was tired, Hermione said defensively. Did Rose get to school okay? It was fine, Draco assured her. Hermione finished her breakfast, kissed his cheek, and wandered upstairs to go get ready for the trip to Ollivanders. Draco finished reading the newspaper while he waited for Hermione's to return. The Daily Prophet was littered with editorials concerning the divorce bill up for vote, both for and against, with accompanying comments from various ministry officials with similar views as the journalist writing the article. The society page was full of speculation on the fate of Draco and Hermione's relationship, should the bill pass or not pass. Both sides seemed to agree that the divorce bill would have no impact on the longevity of their relationship. But should the divorce bill pass, speculation abounded on when they could expect an announcement of upcoming nuptials. Hermione returned to the dining room, just as Draco was closing the paper. She was dressed warmly for a visit to Diagon Alley in a lilac cashmere sweater and navy dress pants. She had her navy peacoat draped over her arm. "What if he says he won't vote with us?" Hermione worried as Draco helped her put her coat on. Draco wrapped his arms around her waist. Hermione leaned back into his embrace. Draco planted a kiss on her temple. "Stop worrying so much," Draco said with assurance. "Everything will turn out just fine." Draco approached this divorce bill as he'd approached many things in his life. His typical Malfoy self-assurance didn't allow room for any doubt that he would fail. Draco was determined to get what he wanted, and he'd done everything in his power to ensure that his aims were achieved. Hermione would be divorced tomorrow. Draco was absolutely assured of that. "I know, Hermione said, worrying her lip and wringing his hands. "You just want everyone to vote with you because you think you're right," Draco said. Hermione stiffened, ready to defend herself. Draco continued cajolingly before she could interrupt. "And you are right in this instance, but you'll never get everyone to agree with you. That's just not how politics works." "But it's the right thing," Hermione protested. "People deserve not to be forced to stay in unhappy marriages." "I agree with you," Draco reassured her, "but you know the world isn't always black and white. People don't always agree what is right and wrong." "I hear what you're saying," Hermione said haltingly. "It just means a lot to me that this passes." Draco kissed her temple again. "I know. It means a lot to me, too." They took the flue to the leaky cauldron. The two of them stepping out of the fireplace caused a few curious stares among the few patrons scattered around the pub. Hannah waved to them from behind the bar and called a greeting. They called their hellos back to her but didn't stop to talk. Hermione and Draco exited the leaky and made their way into Diagon Alley. The street was quiet, with morning shoppers strolling leisurely down the street. The cold, rainy weather that pervaded Muggle London didn't affect the wizarding shopping center. It would not do for witches and wizards to be slipping and sliding down the cobbled streets. Draco opened the door to the dark and musty wand shop. He'd been to Ollivander's 3 times in his life. Draco's first visit was like many witches and wizards. The pompous youth entered Ollivander's with his mother and father to pick out his first wand. After the war, the wand never seemed to work right for Draco. After his probation was lifted, he'd gone to Ollivander's to ask for help. Draco was surprised to find that his changed nature was the reason the wand wouldn't work anymore. He simply wasn't the same person he'd been at 11, which didn't seem much of a surprise to Ollivander. Draco's second wand was chosen, an 18-inch elm wand with a dragon heartstring core. It was very similar to the Malfoy wand that had been passed down for generations, before being destroyed by Voldemort. A wand that was rumored to have belonged to Armand Malfoy. Ollivander behaved oddly when this wand chose Draco, but refused to explain himself, just stating that it was curious that the wand had chosen him. The third visit was like many parents' visit to the shop, accompanying their excited offspring as they took up their heritage and were paired with their first wands. Scorpius came home with an 11-inch cedar wand with a unicorn hair core. The chime above the door rang as Hermione and Draco stepped inside. Ollivander's shop was as it had always been. Wands in their boxes were stacked on shelves behind the counter, organized in a way that probably only Ollivander knew. Garrick Ollivander wandered up from the back of the store. The old wand-maker hadn't changed much over the years. His graying hair stuck out at odd angles, as if he'd gotten frustrated and started pulling out his own hair. Ollivander spotted Hermione first, and a toothy grin broke out on the old wizard's face, deep lines bracketing his mouth. Ollivander grasped both of Hermione's hands in his. "It's so wonderful to see you again, my dear," he beamed. "Always a pleasure, Mr. Ollivander," Hermione said, smiling up at the wizard. Ollivander let go of Hermione's hands. "I've been wondering when I would see you two in my shop. I've been expecting you for months now." Ollivander smiled at the two of them. "I'm sorry," Hermione started, unsure, looking between Draco and Ollivander. "Why were you expecting us?" "The wands," Ollivander said, looking like that should answer their questions and not raise more. "Let's see them." he said, gesturing impatiently for them to hand over their wands. Draco followed Hermione's lead and handed his wand over to the wizard. Ollivander held a wand in each hand and looked at them in wonder. Very rare, Ollivander muttered to himself. I've been meaning to ask, Hermione began. Why is it that I can use Draco's wand just as easily as mine? Ollivander looked at Hermione as if she had expected her to have already figured it out. Draco looked sharply at the man. It had been a long month. Neither of them had devoted any time to contemplate why their wands responded to each other's commands. Ollivander handed their wands back to them. I remember when you came in to get your replacement wand, Ollivander said to Hermione with a distracted air. I hadn't even opened the shop back up yet. 13 inches seeded wood with a dragon heartstring, reasonably springy. Yes, but why? Hermione tried to interrupt. Ollivander turned to Draco, gesturing at him with an open hand and ignoring Hermione's attempt to interrupt. And then you came in a year later. Your wand was not responding to you anymore. It was really no wonder, with everything you've gone through. The wand that chose you was very much like the Malfoy wand. Very sad that it was destroyed. Very old, very old. Okay, but why? Hermione tried again. It's the cores, Ollivander said as if it were apparent. Dragon heartstring cores weren't that uncommon. Draco didn't understand why it should seem obvious that their wands responded to each other. Ollivander sighed dramatically at Draco and Hermione's identical blank looks. Antipodian dragons mate for life. Your cores came from a mated pair. The wands are mates. Ollivander made his shocking announcement and started pacing the front of the shop. I didn't think anything of it until young Malfoy came in and claimed the second wand, but I've known you two were supposed to be together for 14 years. Draco didn't quite care for how smug the wizard looked as he imparted that information. Why didn't you say something? Hermione asked aghast. The smug look fell from the wizard's face at Hermione's tone. I didn't think you weren't together, Ollivander stammered helplessly. You didn't think that it would be important for either of us to know that our wands were mated, Hermione snarled. You didn't think it was significant for either of us to know that we're supposed to be together. Ollivander seemed to wither under Hermione's sharp glare. Draco was just impressed that she hadn't pointed her wand at the wizard. The wands are rare, Ollivander tried pathetically to explain. Wand makers usually don't use heartstrings from Antipodian dragons if the dragon was mated because both must be used. And then there's the risk of using a mated wand, but I was short on supplies and I was willing to use whatever I could get. They were rather cheap because wand makers typically don't buy them. Ollivander got distracted by his thoughts and muttered wistfully. But they came out beautifully, though. Some of my best work. That still doesn't cover why you chose not to say anything for 14 years, Hermione interjected sharply. Ollivander jerked, pulled from his reverie. In a quiet, pleading voice, Ollivander tried to better explain himself. The war had just ended. Only a month gone by, when you came in, Hermione. I didn't mention it when the wand picked you. I didn't think it mattered. When young Malfoy came in a year later, and your wand's mate chose him, I didn't mention it to him. You were tortured in his home. I still remember what your screams sounded like as his aunt tortured you. He was a Death Eater. I wasn't going to tell him that his wand had a mate, that it meant that you two were supposed to be together. I thought I was protecting you. Draco didn't like the excuse, but considering what had happened to Hermione in his home, he could understand why the old wizard didn't say anything to him. Ollivander probably thought he would be handing Hermione over to be abused again, not that he would possibly be saving her from years of abuse at Weasley's hands. Draco rubbed his hands down Hermione's arms, trying to calm her. Hermione was quickly losing her patience with the wizard, no doubt envisioning everything that could have been different in their lives had she known that one detail. Once again, a choice had kept them apart, delayed him finding her, and it was difficult for Draco to accept. You mentioned something about the risks of using a mated wand, Draco said, trying to direct the wand-maker's attention to himself, instead of the desperate pleading the wand-maker was currently subjected and infuriated Hermione to. Ollivander's gaze snapped to Draco, and he looked bewildered for a moment by the statement. A shudder passed through Ollivander, and then he answered the direct question as if the answer was evident to anyone with half a brain. Draco barely refrained from hexing the wizard, and only because the answers were far more important than his need to release his aggravation on the old wand-maker. Well, they won't duel against one another, that's obvious. Ollivander ignored Hermione's growl of impatience and started pacing around the front of the shop. Wands are made to be protective of their owners, but mated wands are difficult because they are oftentimes more protective of their mates to the point where they may risk the owners in order to protect their mate from harm. Ollivander stopped pacing and looked at them. "That's why wand makers don't use them. People don't want wands that might not protect them." Ollivander started pacing again, and Draco's hand twitched on his wand, wanting to immobilize the wizard and get him to hurry up with his explanation. Hermione didn't seem to be in a better state. Her hair was starting to fluff out with little blue sparks zinging out at the ends. "They're notoriously difficult to pass down to family members. The 2 wands can't go to just anyone." Ollivander muttered as he wore the floorboards down in front of them. "Don't you think—" Hermione spluttered in rage. She stepped in front of Ollivander to stop his pacing and wagged an admonishing finger in his face. "Don't you think it would have been important for us to know this when we got our wands? It would have been nice to know at least that my wand had a mate that it couldn't duel against." Hermione spun on her heel and stalked towards the door. Draco followed her. She had her hand on the doorknob when Ollivander called after her. "I'm sorry, Hermione." Hermione looked coldly at the old wizard, her voice glacial as she said, "Sometimes saying nothing does far more harm than telling an uncomfortable truth." Hermione harshly wrenched the door open and stalked out into the cold London air. Draco quietly closed the shop door, not bothering to look behind him at Ollivander, and walked down the steps to join her on the sidewalk. "I'm so mad," Hermione said heatedly when Draco joined her. Draco almost resigned to it. He could even understand Ollivander's actions in not saying anything to him. The old wand-maker had spent time as a guest in the Malfoy dungeons for a time. Draco considered himself lucky that the wizard had even been willing to sell him a wand. There was nothing he could do now to change Ollivander's actions. They couldn't go back and change any of the choices that led them away from each other. "I know," Draco said, then shrugged. "Well, at least that answered a question." He guided her down the street away from the front of Ollivander's shop in case the old wizard decided to try to accost Hermione on the street with more apologies. It wouldn't do for the prophet to catch a photo of Hermione hexing the beloved wand-maker in the street. Hermione stopped and stamped her foot in anger and frustration. "Why aren't you madder about this?" she demanded. "There's nothing we can really do," Draco said with an air of resignation. "But we could have been together sooner," Hermione protested. "We made our own choices, too," Draco reminded her. Hermione huffed a little at his statement. They ambled along the street, making their way back to the Leaky. Draco walked beside her with an arm draped over her shoulder. Hermione eventually wrapped an arm around his waist. "We didn't ask him how he was planning to vote tomorrow," Hermione said quietly. Draco looked down at her and smiled. "Well, we can go back and ask him if you want," he said, still grinning. Hermione looked incensed by the prospect of going back to ask Ollivander to vote with them tomorrow. "I'm not going back in there to beg for his vote," she huffed. "I don't know," Draco started playfully. "He would probably agree to anything you asked of him right now," Draco finished with Slytherin slyness. Hermione looked up at him with narrowed eyes. A calculating gleam came over her face. But then she shook her head and said, "No, I'm just as likely to hex him right now as ask him anything." Draco shrugged with a careless lift of his shoulders. "We can guilt-trip him tomorrow, then, during the council meeting," Draco said with an air of unconcern.